There is a question I have asked myself every single day for 23 years. What would my life have looked like if he had given up? I have sat on this bench for 3 decades. I have seen every kind of person this city produces walk through those doors. The guilty, the innocent, the desperate, the arrogant. And I have learned, slowly, painfully, at great cost, that the most dangerous assumption any judge can make is that he already knows which one he is looking at before the story has been told. The morning I am about to tell you about began like every other February morning in this courthouse. Cold air pressing through the walls, the smell of burning coffee and old wood, a stack of files on my desk, each one representing a human life reduced to a charge and a case number. Case 4471-B was 4 paragraphs long. Breaking and entering, no fixed address. Found sleeping on the floor of an abandoned pharmacy at 4 in the morning, wrapped in a moving blanket, in 16 degrees below zero. I looked at him when he walked in, a tall man, a worn jacket with a patched elbow, mismatched shoelaces on shoes that had once been expensive, and hands that were folded on the table in front of him with a precision that stopped me cold. Because I had seen those hands before, not in a file, not in a photograph, in an operating room at 3 o'clock in the morning, when every other voice in that hospital had quietly decided I was not going to do it through the night. I knew, the moment I saw him, that something was deeply, catastrophically wrong with the story this courtroom thought it was about to tell. And when I stepped down from my bench and asked him the one question nobody else in that room had thought to ask, what he said next silenced every single person in that courthouse. Stay with me, because this is not a story about a crime. This is a story about what happens when the man who saved your life is standing in front of you in a courtroom, and it is your turn to save his. Before we begin the story, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, empathy, and hidden truths resonate with you, be sure to subscribe to the channel. There is a particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. I learned that early in my career, in the first winters I spent behind that bench, watching people walk through those doors with the specific posture of someone who has already accepted that today will not go well for them. They come in shoulders forward, eyes down, hands searching for pockets to disappear into. The building is warm enough. The heating system groans and clanks through the pipes in the walls like an old man complaining about his knees, and it does its job well enough. But the cold I am talking about is not the kind you fix with a thermostat. It is the cold of being seen as a case number. 32 years on this bench. I have seen that cold settle over thousands of people the moment they stepped through those double doors and realized that the room they had just entered did not care about them. Not as people, not as fathers or daughters or neighbors or any of the other things a human being is before life reduces them to a charge sheet. The system is not cruel. I want to be clear about that. Cruelty requires intention. The system is something far more dangerous than cruel. It is indifferent. And indifference, I have found, does more damage than malice ever could, because at least malice can be reasoned with. That February morning, I arrived at the courthouse at 9 o'clock, 2 minutes late, as I always did. My clerks had learned long ago not to comment on it. I hung my coat on the hook behind my chamber door, poured coffee I would not drink, and sat down with the morning's case files. There were 11 of them. Parking violations, a noise complaint, a disputed fence line between neighbors who had clearly once been friends and were now conducting their hatred through the formal language of property law. And then, near the bottom of the stack, a single sheet that took me less than 30 seconds to read. Case 4471-B. State versus Samuel Elwood Hartley. Breaking and entering. Misdemeanor. The defendant had been found sleeping inside an abandoned pharmacy on the corner of Clement and Fifth Avenue at 3:47 in the morning by a routine patrol. No merchandise was taken. No property was damaged beyond a side window that, according to the arresting officer's report, had already been broken before the defendant arrived. I set the sheet down. I picked up my coffee. I did not drink it. There was something about that file, something I could not yet name, that made me read it twice, then a third time. I do not know what I was looking for. Perhaps I already sensed, in the way that 32 years of this work occasionally grants you a sensation that has no rational basis whatsoever, that this one was different. Or perhaps I am only telling myself that now, with the benefit of knowing how it ended. Memory is a dishonest narrator. I have never fully trusted it, not even my own. The courtroom filled slowly that morning, the way it always does in February, when the gray sky outside presses down on the city like a hand, and people move through their obligations at half speed. I heard the bailiff call the session to order. I heard the scrape of chairs, the rustle of coats, the low percussion of a room settling into its formal posture. I arranged my papers. I adjusted my glasses. I prepared to be a judge. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened, and the man who walked in stopped me. Not with anything dramatic. He did not stumble or cry or make any sound at all. He simply walked, slowly, carefully. The walk of a man who has learned to take up as little space as possible in rooms that do not expect him, and took his place at the defendant's table beside his public defender, and folded his hands in front of him on the wood. It was the hands. That is what reached across the room and took hold of something in the center of my chest before I had processed a single other detail about him. The hands of a tall man, broad through the shoulders even now, in a navy jacket so worn that someone had patched the right elbow with black electrical tape, a plaid shirt beneath it, faded to a pale ghost of whatever color it had once been, buttoned completely to the top with a precision that felt almost defiant, as if that last button were the one thing in his life he could still control. His shoes were leather, or had been once. Now they were held together by two different shoelaces, and a refusal to accept that they were finished. But the hands were folded together on the table in front of him with a stillness that was not calm. It was discipline. The discipline of a man who had spent a very long time doing something that required his hands to be absolutely, unconditionally reliable. They trembled, barely. A tremor so small that anyone not looking directly would miss it entirely. But they were folded, and they stayed folded. He did not look up at me. I sat very still behind my bench, and I felt something I had not felt in a long, long time. Longer than I could immediately calculate. A recognition that came from somewhere below thought, somewhere in the body itself. A memory that lived not in the mind, but in the scar tissue along my left side. In the particular way my ribs had ached for years after they were put back together. In the sound of a voice I had heard once at 3 o'clock in the morning when the darkness was very close and getting closer, saying simply, steadily, without a tremor of doubt, "You're going to be all right. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." I pressed my finger against the bridge of my glasses and pushed them back into place. I looked at the man with the folded hands and the patched elbow and the mismatched shoelaces, and I thought, it cannot be. I opened the file. I began. I have read thousands of charge sheets in my life. Thousands. I stopped counting somewhere in the second decade when I realized that counting was a way of keeping the cases at a distance, of turning human beings into statistics I could manage from behind the safety of a number. I stopped counting, and I started reading. Really reading. Not just the charges, but the spaces between them. What was not written. What the formal language of accusation was designed, whether intentionally or not, to erase. The charge sheet for case 4471-B was 4 paragraphs long. It said that Samuel Elwood Hartley, age 58, of no fixed address, had been apprehended at 3:47 in the morning on the 14th of February on the premises of the former Kellerman Pharmacy, 412 Clement Street, a property closed and pending sale for the past 11 months. It said that entry had been gained through a side window. It said that the responding officers had found the defendant asleep on the floor of the back storeroom, wrapped in what appeared to be a moving blanket. It said that no merchandise had been removed, and no additional damage to the property had been identified beyond the pre-existing broken window, which appeared in photographs taken at the time of the building's closure 11 months prior. 4 paragraphs, no fixed address. That phrase. I have always hated that phrase, no fixed address, as if the only thing the law needed to know about a man's life was that it had come loose from its moorings and was drifting, as if the drifting were the whole story, as if there were no question worth asking about what had caused it, or when, or whether the man himself had fought the current before the current won. The public defender, Otis Green, a good man ground down by too many years and too many files, stood and confirmed the plea. Not guilty. His voice carried the specific flatness of someone delivering a line they do not expect to matter. I watched him settle back into his chair without looking at his client, and I felt a familiar sadness that had nothing to do with judgment. Otis had been a passionate lawyer once. I had seen it. The system had not broken him exactly. It had simply worn the edges off, the way water wears stone gradually and without malice, until the sharp places that once caught on injustice were smooth and offered no resistance. The prosecutor, Claire Donovan, rose with the clean efficiency of someone who had not yet been worn. She was young, 34 perhaps, with the posture of a person who still believed that doing her job correctly was the same as doing what was right. She was not wrong to believe that. She had simply not yet encountered enough cases where those two things pointed in opposite directions. She read the charge with precision: breaking and entering, trespassing on private property. She cited the relevant statutes. She noted the defendant's lack of a permanent address as a factor in assessing flight risk. She requested a modest fine and a formal trespass prohibition, barring the defendant from the property and its surrounding block. It was all correct. Every word of it was legally, procedurally, absolutely correct. And it landed in that courtroom like a sentence being read over a grave. I watched Samuel Hartley during all of it. He did not move. His eyes were on the table in front of him, on his own folded hands, and he held himself with the stillness of a man who had made a private decision somewhere along the way to stop expecting anything from rooms like this one. Not bitterness, not anger. Something quieter and in some ways more devastating than either. Acceptance. The deep, exhausted acceptance of someone who has been processed by enough systems to know exactly how this particular machine works and has stopped hoping it might malfunction in his favor. The fluorescent light above the defendant's table flickered twice. The heating pipes knocked in the walls. From somewhere in the back of the room, someone coughed. I looked down at the charge sheet. I looked at the words, no fixed address. I looked at the words, moving blanket. I looked at the single detail buried in the 3rd paragraph that the prosecutor had read aloud without pause, without inflection, as simply another data point in a sequence of data points. The defendant was found asleep, and I thought about what a February night at 16 below zero feels like, when there is no door between you and it. Then I looked at his hands again. The tremor, the discipline holding the tremor in place, the precision of the fold. I set the charge sheet down. I took off my glasses. I cleaned them with the small cloth I keep in the breast pocket of my robe, a habit my wife had found endearing for 40 years, and which I had continued after she was gone because some habits are no longer about the original reason. I put them back on. And then I did something that made Otis Green look up from his notes for the first time since the session began, and made Claire Donovan pause with her pen half raised, and made the bailiff shift his weight almost imperceptibly toward the center of the room. I stood up. Not to adjourn, not to recess. I stood up and I came around the side of my bench and I walked down onto the floor of my own courtroom, which I had not done in, I would have to think carefully about the last time, years. I walked to the railing that separated the gallery from the proceedings, and I rested both hands on the top of it, and I looked at Samuel Hartley from a distance of perhaps 6 feet. He felt it, the shift in the room. He looked up. Our eyes met for the second time that morning. And for the second time I felt it, that pull of recognition, that physical certainty arriving ahead of any logical confirmation, that sense of a memory the body holds more faithfully than the mind. I kept my voice even. I had spent 32 years learning to keep my voice even in precisely the moments when it wanted most to break. Mr. Hartley, I said, before we proceed any further, I would like to ask you something. And I would like you to take whatever time you need before you answer. He watched me, still, waiting. The courtroom held its breath. Tell me, I said, why you did this. He did not answer immediately. That was the first thing I noticed. Most people, when a judge steps down from the bench and asks them a direct question, respond in one of two ways. They either talk too fast, the words tumbling out in a cascade of explanation and self-defense, each sentence tripping over the one before it, or they go completely silent, paralyzed by the formality of the moment. Samuel Hartley did neither. He simply looked at me, with those dark brown eyes that were still, underneath everything, unmistakably intelligent, and he took the time I had offered him. He took a long, slow breath, and then he spoke. He told me about the cold first, not as an excuse. He was precise about that, almost clinical, as if he were presenting a case history rather than his own life. He said that he had been moving between the shelter on Grover Street and the underpass at 5th and Madison for the previous 3 weeks, depending on availability and temperature. He said that on the night of the 14th, the shelter had been at capacity by 6 in the evening, and that by midnight, the temperature had dropped to a point where remaining outside was no longer, in his assessment, a survivable decision. In his assessment. Those words, the language of a man who had spent decades making clinical assessments, making them under pressure, in the middle of the night, with other people's lives depending on the accuracy of his judgment. He said the window was already broken. He said he had not planned it. He said he had simply been walking, which is what he did on the nights when the cold was bad and the shelters were full, because movement generates heat and heat is survival. And he had passed the pharmacy and seen the dark interior and the broken window and made a calculation that shamed him and that he had made anyway, because the alternative was a different kind of shame entirely, the shame of a body found on a sidewalk in February. He stopped. His hands tightened slightly against each other on the table. And then I asked him the question I had been building towards since the moment he walked through that door. Before all of this, I said quietly, who were you? The courtroom shifted. I heard Claire Donovan set her pen down. I heard Otis Green's chair creak as he turned to look at his own client. Samuel Hartley looked at his hands. I was a doctor, he said, cardiovascular surgeon. 26 years. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room recalibrating, of people doing the rapid, uncomfortable arithmetic of before and after, of a narrative refusing to stay the shape they had assigned it. I said nothing. I waited, and the dam broke. Not loudly. That is the thing about grief that has been contained for a very long time. When it finally moves, it does not crash. It seeps. It finds the hairline fractures that have been forming for years, and it moves through them quietly, steadily, with the patience of something that always knew it would get through eventually. He told me about his daughter, Emma, 11 years old. He told me about the leukemia, about the specific cruelty of being a physician watching his own child's blood work and understanding every number with a precision that a less knowledgeable parent would have been spared. He told me about the 9 months between diagnosis and the end, and about the morning after, which he described only as the morning the world changed shape and never changed back. He told me about his wife, Sarah, and how they had tried for 2 years to hold each other up, and how there had come a day when they both understood that they were no longer holding each other up but pulling each other down, and how she had left not out of cruelty, but out of the same exhaustion that he himself felt in every cell of his body. He told me he did not blame her. His voice was completely steady when he said this, which told me more about the depth of the wound than any amount of weeping could have. He told me about the drinking. He was precise about this too, almost academic, the way physicians often are when discussing their own pathologies, as if the clinical distance makes it more manageable. He said he had known exactly what he was doing. He said that was the particular hell of being a doctor with a substance problem. You understand the mechanism completely. You can narrate your own destruction with absolute accuracy, and the understanding does nothing whatsoever to stop it. He said he had lost his license on a Tuesday. He said he remembered it was a Tuesday because he had had a patient scheduled for a bypass that Thursday. And his first thought, standing in the licensing board's office, was not about himself, but about who would do that surgery instead. That detail hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. I let the ripples move. Then I looked at him for a long moment. This man, this tall, worn, brilliant, broken man in his patched jacket and his mismatched shoelaces, who had walked into my courtroom as case 4471B and who was now something else entirely, something the law had no precise category for, which is the condition of almost every human being who has ever stood in a place like this and tried to explain how they arrived there. I said his name. Samuel. He looked up. In September of 2001, I said, and my voice was doing something I was working hard to control. Did you perform emergency cardiovascular surgery at St. Catherine's Hospital on a 44-year-old male patient admitted with internal hemorrhaging following a motor vehicle accident on Interstate 80, a surgery that lasted approximately 9 hours? A patient whose attending physicians had documented as having a low probability of surviving the night. The color left his face, not gradually, all at once, the way light leaves a room when the switch is thrown. He stared at me. I watched the recognition move through him. Slowly at first, then faster, the pieces assembling themselves from whatever archive they had been stored in through years of grief and dissolution and cold February nights. His eyes traveled across my face with an intensity I recognized as the look of a man whose mind has suddenly, and against all odds, located something he had stopped believing he would ever see again. "My God," he whispered. "Yes," I said simply. "It's me." And Samuel Elwood Hartley, surgeon, father, widower, man of science, man of sorrow, man who had held the lives of strangers in his precise and steady hands for 26 years, and then lost his grip on his own, covered his face. His shoulders came apart. The sound he made was not loud. It was the sound of something that had been held under enormous pressure for an enormous amount of time, finally being allowed to surface. I gripped the railing. I did not trust myself to speak for several seconds. When I finally looked up at the courtroom, Claire Donovan had her hand pressed flat against her sternum, as if checking that her heart was still where she had left it. Otis Green was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man conducting urgent negotiations with his own tear ducts. The bailiff had found something of extraordinary interest to examine on the middle distance somewhere to the left of the exit sign. I straightened. I walked back to my bench. I sat down. I folded my hands in front of me. And I noticed distantly that I had folded them the same way he had, with that same careful, deliberate precision. I noticed it, and I did not unfold them. I looked at Samuel Hartley, who had lowered his hands from his face, and was watching me now with red eyes and an expression I can only describe as the look of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be witnessed, to be truly, fully seen. I took a breath. "Samuel Elwood Hartley," I said, and my voice was the steadiest it had been all morning, steadier than I had any right to expect. "This court finds that the public interest is not served by the prosecution of this case." I saw Claire Donovan open her mouth. I raised one hand gently and she closed it. "All charges in case 4471-B are hereby dismissed." I reached for my gavel. I paused, with it in my hand, and I looked at him one final time before I brought it down. "This court also wishes to state, for the permanent record of these proceedings, that the man standing before it today is not a criminal. He is a physician. He is a father. He is a human being who gave more to this community than this community ever thought to give back. And this court is profoundly and personally in his debt." I brought the gavel down. The sound of it, that single, clean, definitive strike of wood on wood, echoed in the room for what felt like much longer than it should have. And then the room erupted. Not in noise exactly, in release. The specific collective exhale of a group of people who have been holding something they did not know they were holding and have suddenly been given permission to put it down. I stood. I looked at Samuel Hartley one last time, and I bowed my head. A small movement, a private one, the gesture of a man acknowledging a debt that no gavel, no verdict, no formal language of any court in any jurisdiction could ever fully repay. He saw it. His chin dropped to his chest. His shoulders shook once silently, and that was enough. I have a photograph on the wall of my chambers. It is not a dramatic photograph. It is not the kind of image that stops you when you walk past it. No grand landscape, no formal portrait, no moment of obvious historical weight. It is a small thing, taken with a cheap camera by a nurse who happened to be passing a hallway at St. Catherine's Hospital on a Thursday morning in September of 2001. It shows a surgeon walking away from the camera, still in his operating scrubs, his shoulders carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has just spent 9 hours doing something that required everything he had. His head is slightly bowed. His hands hang at his sides. You cannot see his face. You never could. I had kept that photograph for 23 years in a drawer, because something about it felt too private to display and too important to discard. The morning after the trial, I took it out of the drawer and I put it on the wall. I am looking at it now as I tell you this story. It still does not show his face, but I know who he is. I have always known who he was, even in the years when I had lost the name and kept only the memory of the hands, the voice, the refusal to leave. In the weeks that followed case 4471-B, several things happened quietly, the way the most important things usually do. Claire Donovan made 2 phone calls on the afternoon of the trial. I did not know about them until later, when she told me herself. She stopped by my chambers one evening about a month after, ostensibly to drop off paperwork, and mentioned them in the careful, slightly sideways manner of a young person sharing something they are not entirely sure they had the authority to do. The first call was to the State Medical Licensing Board, initiating a formal petition for review of Samuel Hartley's license suspension on the grounds of documented mitigating circumstances. Specifically, the acute grief and complicated bereavement that had preceded and precipitated his impairment. The second call was to the director of the Riverside Recovery and Rehabilitation Center, a facility the courthouse worked with periodically, where she had arranged for an immediate intake appointment, fully covered, no waiting list. She told me this in a voice that was trying very hard to be professionally neutral, and not quite succeeding. I told her that I thought she was going to be a remarkable attorney. She looked at the floor for a moment and then thanked me in a voice that was not professionally neutral at all. Otis Green, I heard through the particular informal network that operates in every courthouse in the world, the one made of hallway conversations and shared elevators, and the silent semaphore of people who have worked in the same building for decades. Otis Green went home on the evening of the trial and called his son. They had not spoken in 3 years. I do not know the details of that conversation, and I would not share them if I did. What I know is that Otis came into work the following Monday with a slightly different quality of presence. Something that had been switched off for a long time had been switched back on. His files were still a mess. His suit was still the same brown one, but he looked at the people sitting next to him at the defendant's table differently. He looked at them the way he had once looked at them, before the years had taught him not to. That is not nothing. In a courthouse, that is very far from nothing. Samuel Hartley entered the rehabilitation program the week after the trial. I know this because he wrote me a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, the penmanship of a man trained in an era when handwriting was considered a professional responsibility. He did not thank me effusively. That was not his register. He wrote the way he had spoken in the courtroom, precisely, carefully, with the clinical self-awareness of someone who has examined himself honestly and is not flinching from what the examination revealed. He said that he had not been certain, walking into that courtroom, that he wanted to be saved. He said that was the truth, and he felt I deserved the truth. He said that somewhere between my stepping down from the bench and the sound of the gavel, something in him had changed its mind. He said he thought perhaps it was simply the experience of being seen. I read that letter 4 times. I have it in the same drawer where the photograph used to be. 18 months after Case 4471B, Samuel Elwood Hartley's medical license was reinstated by the State Medical Licensing Board, following a full review. The decision was not front-page news. It was a paragraph in the local medical journal, the kind of item that most people scroll past without stopping. But I stopped. I read it 3 times, and then I sat in my office for a while without doing anything in particular. And I thought about a nurse with a cheap camera in a hallway, and a surgeon walking away with his head bowed and his hands at his sides. He did not return to hospital surgery. I think that chapter of his life had required too much of him to revisit, and he had made his peace with that. Instead, he opened a clinic. It is on the east side of the city, on a block that the rest of the city has mostly decided to look away from. The kind of block where the people who fall through the cracks in every other system eventually land. He called it the Hartley Free Clinic, which I thought was simultaneously the most modest and the most quietly courageous act of naming I had ever encountered, because it required him to put his own name on something in a neighborhood where his name had once meant nothing except failure and disappearance. He staffed it with volunteer physicians and medical students, and one remarkably organized administrator named Rosa, who had previously been unhoused herself, and who, by all accounts, ran the place with an efficiency that made hospital administrators look leisurely. He treats people who have no insurance, no address, no one else to call. People who come in with infections that have been untreated for months because treatment requires a system, and the system requires documentation, and the documentation requires a stability they do not have. People who are, in every way that the formal architecture of medicine is designed to serve, invisible. He sees them. That is what he does. He sees them. I visited the clinic once, about a year after it opened. I did not announce myself. I simply walked in on a Wednesday morning and sat in the waiting area for a while, among the people waiting to be seen. Nobody recognized me without the robe, which is as it should be. A judge out of his courtroom is simply a man in his 60s with white hair and glasses, which describes approximately half the retired population of any American city. After a while, Samuel came out of one of the examination rooms. He was in a white coat, a simple one, no embroidery, no hospital insignia, and he was reading a chart, and his hands were not trembling. He looked up and saw me. He stopped. We looked at each other across a waiting room full of people who had nowhere else to be. He nodded once. I nodded once. That was all. That was enough. I have thought in the years since about what it means to save a life. We use that phrase casually. He saved my life, she saved my life. And we usually mean something specific and dramatic by it. A surgery, a rescue, a moment of intervention at the precise instant when things could have gone one way or the other, and someone ensured they went the right way. But I have come to think, sitting in this chair behind this bench for 32 years, that saving a life is rarely a single moment. It is an accumulation. It is the nurse who stays an extra hour. It is the lawyer who makes a phone call she did not have to make. It is the man who opens a door that the world had decided should stay closed. It is the judge who steps down from his bench and asks a simple question that no one else in the room thought to ask. Why did you do this? 4 words, not accusation, not indictment. Not the cold machinery of a system processing a case number. Just 4 words that say, underneath everything, I see you. You are still a person. Your reason matters to me. That is the whole of it, I think. That is the thing the law gets right on its best days, and wrong on all the others. On its best days, the law is not a machine at all. It is a person, standing in a room, deciding to look at another person and ask the question that costs nothing and changes everything. I have been doing this for 32 years. I have gotten it wrong more times than I can count, and I carry every one of those times with me, because they deserve to be carried. But some days, not many, but some, I have gotten it right. And on those days, I drive home through whatever weather February has decided to offer. And I hang up my coat, and I make coffee I will actually drink this time. And I sit in the chair by the window, and I think about a man walking down a hospital hallway with his head bowed and his hands at his sides. And I think, I am still here because he refused to leave. The least I can do is return the favor. Every single day that I am given, for as long as this bench will have me, the least I can do is stay. If this story moved you, stop for just a moment and reflect. Have you ever looked at someone on the street, in a waiting room, in a courtroom of your own life, and made a decision about who they were before you knew what they had been through? Have you ever been that person yourself, the one people had already decided about before you had the chance to speak? And ask yourself this: is there someone in your life right now who once gave you everything they had, and who you have quietly forgotten to look for? Tell us your thoughts and feelings in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about compassion, second chances, and the kind of justice that begins the moment one human being truly sees another, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because there are more Samuel Hartleys out there, and every one of them deserves to be seen.